Good afternoon. My name is Lauren Cooper, and I'm the lead of the Forest Carbon and Climate program at Michigan State University. Welcome to our webinar today. We are so pleased to have hosted the 2018-2019 Learning Exchange Series for the Forest Climate Working Group. For those that are not familiar with the group, the Forest Climate Working Group is a diverse group of forest interests, including landowners, industry actors, conservationists, academia, and those active with carbon markets. The group has worked together for 10 years to advocate for state and federal policies to ensure sustainable forest use and the prevention of land use change. Please note that this is the last session for the 2018-2019 year. So I'm going to say it a few times in this session today, but thank you so much to our supporters and participants. It's really been a fantastic year. I know I've learned a lot. We've gotten really great feedback. And as we begin planning for the 2019-2020 year, please let us know if you have suggestions for speakers in the next year or would like to nominate yourself or a team of individuals that you know are doing some interesting work in this space. We would really love to hear from you. And before we highlight our speaker today, Sarah Wescott of the Climate Action Reserve, I wanted to take a moment to highlight a learning opportunity for those that wanted to learn more. Especially over the summer. We're going to take next month off in the webinar series. For those interested, the Michigan State University Forest Carbon and Climate program will launch a professional development short course called Understanding Forest Carbon Management on July 15th. Even though it is possible to jump on this session about within a month after the start date, will give you a comfortable window of time. We do welcome broad participation, and the learning experience is designed to be intensive but very interdisciplinary. So we welcome a wide range of backgrounds, and we're really delighted to have support from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and this is allowing us to offer subsidized pricing for a limited time, so we'd love to see all of those spaces get used. If you'd like to learn more, please head over to our website or feel free to reach out to us directly if you'd like to get some more information. So to get to today's speaker, I'd like to introduce Sarah Wescott of Climate Action Reserve. Sarah will be presenting on carbon market opportunities and project development tools for forest owners. We're really excited to let Sarah get started, but before we do, we'd like to share just a couple housekeeping details. To automatically receive registration details and information about upcoming webinars, including when we announce the series for next year, please email forestc@msu.edu to join our email list. For those that are affiliated with Society of American Foresters, or SAF, attendees today are qualified to receive 1 CFE credit from SAF. So if you've registered with your email address that you use with SAF, this will be automatically credited to your account, but feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. The session today is being recorded and will be posted to the web, along with any supplemental resources such as the presentation slides. And this happens in about a week or so. If you've registered, you'll receive an email letting you know where to find it. But this is also a good time to mention that we have all of the archived previous recordings on our website. So if you see something of interest in our lineup that you weren't able to attend, it's really a great resource now of some really amazing presentations. So feel free to go there, check it out. There's also some materials to download and links there as well. This session will be followed by a Q&A. So on your Zoom interface, you'll see the word chat with a little drop-down triangle next to it. Here you can offer up questions at any point during the presentations, and we'll compile them and then present questions to the speaker in a Q&A session at the end, time permitting. If you are calling in on the phone, but you do have access to email, you can also send any questions directly to forestc@msu.edu, and we'll make sure your question gets in the lineup. And again, we strongly encourage you to just feel free to put in questions as they pop up during the presentation, because sometimes you may have important questions that you might forget by the end. So feel free to pop them in. And in the case of outstanding questions, if we run out of time, we will follow up with the speaker and have these addressed in a written format, and we'll upload this with the recorded presentation so you can see responses to those questions there. And so with that, we will hand it over to Sarah. So Sarah, will you please share your screen and begin your presentation?
Okay, great. Can you see my screen all right?
Yep, looks great.
All right, thanks, Lauren. So today I'll be covering carbon market opportunities and project development tools for landowners. I'm going to start out by giving some background about the role of offset project registries, what we do as the Climate Action Reserve and the different markets we work in. But we'll spend the majority of my presentation today getting into some of the different tools and resources we make available to landowners, as well as to foresters and technical experts who may be interested in working with landowners to develop or manage carbon projects. So to start out with a little information about the Climate Action Reserve, we're an environmental nonprofit that promotes carbon markets as a way to support sustainable natural resource management, among other offset project types that we work with. We were originally created by the state of California to help establish reporting leading up to the implementation of California's cap and trade program. And from there, we shifted our focus to working primarily on carbon offsets, establishing a voluntary offset registry that eventually served California's compliance market as an early action offset program. And today we continue to operate as an independent nonprofit, running both our voluntary offset registry, as well as working as a California compliance program offset project registry, or OPR. We have 18 protocols that we operate in the US and Mexico, with over 400 projects submitted and over 127 million offset credits issued. So to provide some context for what an offset project registry does, essentially we help guide projects through the different administrative steps between developing a project and issuing credits. So that includes processing listing documents, helping to manage the verification bodies and reviewing their conflict of interest assessments, reviewing final verification documents, auditing projects, which means that occasionally we'll go out on site and actually observe the verification process from start to finish. And we also develop tools both for our voluntary program and for the compliance program. For California's compliance program, we work closely with the California Air Resources Board, which is the agency administering that program. We provide guidance to project participants there and work with them to help resolve project issues. And then on the voluntary side, we operate our own offset registry, where we actually are a little bit more hands-on in terms of developing the offset protocols. When we have new offset protocols under development, we run work group processes, administer public comment periods, and then finalize the protocols, and are a lot more hands-on in providing guidance and trainings to projects along the way on that side. Regardless of the market, though, there are certain key principles that go into ensuring offset quality. So these are all worth noting. Each standardized offset protocol that we develop must take measures to ensure that the offsets issued are real, additional, permanent, verifiable, and that no double counting is taking place. So this is true of the offset protocols that we developed for our voluntary program, as well as the protocols that were adopted by ARB for California. We use a transparent stakeholder work group process to develop these methodologies. Typically that'll include representatives from government, industry, academia, and any other technical stakeholders where applicable. And we also put our protocol drafts out for public comment. So we solicit and consider feedback from stakeholders outside of our work group. And actually, as we speak, we have a new draft of our forest protocol out for public comment. This is what we refer to as version 5.0, because that protocol has gone through many different iterations over the years, and that public comment period will be ending this Friday on July 12th. So to highlight some of the different markets I'll be talking about today, as I mentioned, the Climate Action Reserve operates in both the compliance and voluntary markets. And there are multiple compliance markets and multiple voluntary registries. But for the purpose of today's presentation, generally speaking, when I talk about a compliance market, I'm referring to California's offset program, as that is sort of the most robust compliance offset market that we see today. And then I'll be talking about the Climate Action Reserve's voluntary registry services on the voluntary market. One of the key distinctions between those two markets comes down to the participants and the motivation behind participation. As the name indicates, voluntary carbon markets involve entities who are participating to meet voluntary emission reduction goals, such as targeting a corporate social responsibility goal or operating a carbon neutral event. And then in contrast, the compliance markets involve entities that are mandated to reduce their emissions by law, such as through California's cap and trade program. And the variety of approved methodologies in the compliance and voluntary markets are also quite different. For our voluntary registry, like I mentioned earlier, we operate 18 different offset protocols. So there's a wide variety of different sectors that can be involved with offset projects. Whereas for California's compliance program, they currently have 6 adopted protocols. Another important distinction is related to credit pricing and the actual cost of participation. Credit prices are going to be widely variable on the voluntary market. That's in part because buyers sometimes take into account co-benefits and other aspects of the project beyond emission reductions. Something that we see on the voluntary market is that forest projects are sort of deemed to be more charismatic carbon, and so sometimes they can command a higher price on the voluntary market compared to a project involving industrial gases, for instance. Average prices for our forest project credits have been around $11 per credit. And then on the compliance market, the credit prices are really governed by the auctions. Offset credits offer a cost containment mechanism for the market, and so they tend to track just below the auction price for allowances, and don't really seem to fluctuate much between a forest project versus an ODS project, for instance. Lately, allowances have been selling close to $18, and offsets have been selling just under $15 in the market, to give you an example. And while the average offset price does tend to be higher on the compliance market, the cost of participation is also higher. So those things kind of balance each other out a little bit. This is due largely to an additional regulatory review on the compliance side. After the OPRs complete their reviews, these projects go to ARB for an additional level of review, which just raises the time commitment of the project developers and the verifiers, and more billable hours means that the costs are driven up. And each market also has its own risks. So on the voluntary side, finding buyers and dealing with that price uncertainty can be a big hindrance. But on the compliance side, there are other risks, including delays related to bottlenecks at the regulatory review stage. The cap and trade regulation also has a limited timeline. Currently, the California legislature extended the program through 2030, but as we saw around the last renewal, once the regulation is sort of nearing its sunset, there's a level of uncertainty that enters the market as to whether the state legislators will renew it again, because that's really sort of an unknown until that legislature passes it. Looking ahead, there are also some questions about how these markets will continue to develop. Just to plug one of the past presentations in this series, I think Kelly Hamrick did a good job discussing some of these emerging markets back in April. So for more information, you might want to take a look at that presentation. But I thought it'd be worth providing a little bit of an update since things have changed since then. With California's compliance market, one of the newly introduced elements of the cap and trade regulation is this concept around direct environmental benefits in the state, sometimes referred to as DEBs for short. Compliance entities have limits to the number of offsets that they can use to meet their compliance obligations. And beginning in 2021, no more than half of the offsets used can come from projects that do not provide direct environmental benefits in the state of California. So it sort of is creating a distinction between in-state projects and out-of-state projects. But that being said, we don't actually know how ARB will be evaluating this requirement for out-of-state projects. Potentially arguments can be made for projects perhaps in Oregon, where they're located on a watershed that flows into the state of California. So it'll be interesting to see how that guidance develops and if that leads to a price differential between DEBS credits and non-DEBS credits. But until ARB really provides more information on that, it's kind of an unknown in the market. And then beyond California, Oregon and the province of Ontario were both entities that we were hoping would implement cap and trade programs and link into the Western Climate Initiative. which currently includes California and Quebec. If you've been following the news, particularly around Oregon over the last couple of weeks, you probably saw that that did not happen as we would have hoped. But there's still areas to keep an eye on for potential future markets. I think the governor of Oregon was considering taking executive action to put that into effect. So we'll have to see what happens there. And then lastly, one of the new exciting developments in the market is Corsia, or the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. It's quite a mouthful, hence the acronym. But Corsia is a UN deal designed to help the aviation industry reach its aspirational goal to make all growth in international flights after 2020 carbon neutral. And there are 192 participating countries, and airlines would have to buy emission reduction offsets from other sectors in order to compensate for any increase in their own emissions if they are operating international flights within those countries. The program is currently receiving applications from offset programs to consider which credits it will accept, but potentially this could generate significant credit demand in those markets. So now that we've covered the differences between the markets, and especially the fact that project costs and prices tend to be different between the voluntary and compliance programs, I wanted to put that in perspective for a forest project. Project feasibility and making that initial decision to enroll in an offset project is really the most important question that a landowner faces, and involves a lot of weighing of the costs and the price potential. So forest projects do have a lot of startup costs associated with them. Inventories required for carbon projects are very detailed and can be very costly. And there's also a lot of just sort of technical expertise, a lot of paperwork that needs to be filled out at project startup. And that initial third-party verification can also be very costly, as well as time consuming. So these costs will likely be a bit lower on the voluntary market, where the programs incorporate a little more flexibility. And like I mentioned, there's not that additional round of regulatory review with the project. And then for both markets, there's ongoing verification and maintenance costs, as well as some registry fees that are important to consider. But on the flip side, there's also significant price potential. Like I mentioned, we're seeing about $11 average for voluntary forest credits, about $15 for, or $14 to $15 for compliance offset grade credits. So these are just factors to consider when weighing that decision to enter the carbon market. And then based on the markets as they stand today, this is a quick snapshot of what current forest project participation looks like. And then just a note about the information conveyed on this slide. CRTs, that stands for Climate Reserve Ton, and RBOC stands for ARB Offset Credit, which is the compliance grade credit issued by the California Air Resources Board. But both of these credits represent 1 metric ton of CO2 equivalent reduced or removed, so they're the same unit. For our voluntary program, credits from US forest projects make up about 1/4 of the CRTs that we've issued, and only about 8% of the credits that have been retired to date. And retirement means that an entity has purchased the credit and put it into a retirement account to offset some emissions that they've had in their operations. And the fact that forestry makes up a smaller percentage on the voluntary market is really just a reflection of the wide variety of project types that we have available through that program. For the California Compliance Program, which has sort of been the more active offset market for forest projects, credits from forest projects make up 80% of the total RBOCs issued and 70% of the RBOCs retired. So you can see that there's a major difference there. Forest projects really supply the compliance market with the vast majority of their offsets and is a really critical component of that market. Another major difference I wanted to highlight is the size of the projects. So you'll notice that our voluntary registry has about 70,000 acres in active forest projects, and the average project size is about 3,500 acres per project. Meanwhile, California's program has millions of acres enrolled across active registered projects. And the average project size is about 45,000 acres. So there's a very significant difference there, both in terms of overall reach, but also in terms of that average size. And I can sort of theorize on some of the reasons for that. I think a big part of that is that the compliance market has now sort of matured, and large landowners no longer feel risk averse or like they're taking a big gamble to enter a nascent market. The program has sort of proven itself to have some staying power and stable prices for credits. So we've started to see larger entities enrolling hundreds of thousands of acres at a time, which really drives up that number. And then with higher, more stable prices on the compliance market, you also see projects putting a lot of time into development hours on their inventories, pursuing a really high level of confidence, and doing some really sophisticated baseline modeling to make sure that they're not leaving any credits on the table. And larger projects are really necessary in order to be able to pay off those higher project development costs. And then also, like I mentioned, there's that additional level of regulatory review, and sometimes that comes at multiple stages of project development. So you see more billable hours for the verification team on the compliance side, and higher cost just means a higher minimum size threshold for a project in order to really make things pencil out on the compliance market. We do still have projects in the compliance program that are closer to that 3,500 acre number. And I've heard from some project developers that 5,000 to 8,000 acres is sort of the minimum size that they'll consider. So still not very small. And as a registry operating a forest offset program, we really want to make sure that we're reaching as many landowners as possible. We don't want the threshold to entry to be so high. So a lot of the tools that I'm going to talk about today are really aimed at bringing down costs and reducing that size threshold so that we can get more landowners participating in the program. So before diving into those tools, I want to just quickly review what we mean when we're talking about a forest offset project. So for forest offset projects, there are really three different types. There's reforestation, avoided conversion, and improved forest management. But improved forest management projects have definitely been the most popular project type. So generally that's going to be what I'm talking about. And we call these IFM for short. And IFM projects can really involve any management practices that work to increase sequestration. And then the carbon stocks involved are going to be live trees, both above and below ground carbon, standing dead trees, and then harvested wood products. Soil carbon is only included in rare cases. And then to give a really high-level summary of project crediting, just to bring everyone up to speed on that, project carbon stocks are based on the project's inventory, and then baseline carbon stocks are based on a conservative modeling exercise. And then credits are given for the difference between project and baseline carbon stocks in a given year. Project crediting also accounts for leakage and deducts credits if there is determined to be a risk of leakage at the project in a given year. And a risk-based contribution is also made into the buffer pool, which is an account that insures against reversals caused by natural disturbances. And the buffer pool contribution is around 15 to 20% of the project's credits. And that is just sort of a really high-level view of quantification for these projects. And again, to sort of plug one of the past presentations in this series, if you want more detail than that, I would recommend taking a look at Dylan Jenkins's presentation from January. He did a really great, more in-depth dive of forest project accounting. And then just to sort of review the project development process a little bit, a forest project is really going to begin many years before ever seeing an offset credit. And this is especially true of the compliance market. The project feasibility, scoping, and development process can potentially last a few years. And this makes sense if you think about it, because the decision to enroll land in a project in the first place is a very important decision. This is a multi-decade commitment. and there are a lot of technical considerations that go into an offset project. So this is where we really see most landowners engaging a project development team or some technical consultants. And generally, a few test plots will be installed, and if that's looking good, then a full inventory will commence. And then from that point, the project is listed with a registry and begins the ongoing process of monitoring, reporting, and verification. Once verification is completed, the project will undergo review with the registry to have credits issued. And then if it's a compliance project, it'll have final review with the California Air Resources Board to have those compliance grade credits issued. So at first, it will probably be about 2 to 5 years from project inception to receiving credits. But after that initial step is taken, credit issuance can be annual, really as often as the project would like to be verified, potentially waiting up to 6 years to conduct the next verification in the compliance market. And for our voluntary program, we have certain instances where projects can wait up to 12 years to conduct their next verification. As I was talking about earlier, cost remains a barrier to entry for many landowners, and this is something we've been trying to address in our own program. I've kind of broken down the most significant aspects of project development here into these 4 stages. You have the determination of the project's feasibility, conducting the project's inventory, modeling the baseline, and then conducting the final calculations. These are really the steps that go into initiating a project and then starting in on the monitoring and reporting. Each of these areas also represents potential for significant costs to accumulate. So these are all areas that we've chosen to address through our program. As a registry, we feel like these are places where we can step in and provide assistance to streamline the process. And this is a little bit about how we're doing that. We have several tools and methodologies that we have made available for download on our website. First, we have a feasibility workbook that helps walk users through a really high level feasibility test for conducting an improved forest management project. We also have a standardized inventory methodology and an associated inventory database tool to help develop and manage a project inventory. And as you probably noticed, we like our acronyms over here. So we call those SIM, which is short for Standardized Inventory Methodology, and Carat, which stands for Climate Action Reserve Inventory Tool. The new version of our forest protocol that is currently in the public comment phase incorporates a standardized baseline tool, which should reduce the burden of baseline modeling for improved forest management projects. And then lastly, for years, we've had available different calculation workbooks for different versions of both the voluntary and compliance protocols. So I'll be touching a bit on each of these and showing you a little bit about how they work and how they might help to reduce costs for projects. So first up is our feasibility tool, since this is really that first step in assessing a potential project. Our tool is just geared toward IFM projects at the moment. And it's available in an easy to use Excel workbook format, so it should be accessible to a lot of people. And it's available for free on our website and really just walks users through several key variables to test out in terms of whether a project scenario looks feasible. And this is really meant to be kind of an initial sensitivity analysis to help users assess whether they should think about moving forward with a more intensive feasibility analysis. So this is what the main interface of the tool looks like. So to start, users will enter in some basic information about the project, including project acres, expected growth rate, expected harvest levels, and any encumbrances to harvesting that exist on the property. We also ask that users input a common practice value, which for anyone who's less familiar with the protocol, common practice is based on FIA data and helps inform the project baseline. So in the tool, we do provide some guidelines about how to find the common practice value for the project. We also need projects to enter in an estimate of their initial carbon stocks on the property, which is likely going to involve a little guesswork, especially if you're earlier on in the process. Usually you would need inventory data to be able to accurately assess that. But for folks that are just sort of starting out, I generally recommend that people think about how well stocked their property is compared to their neighbors, and sort of make a judgment call based on that sort of qualitative assessment. If you do end up moving forward in the project development process, this is a number that will definitely need to be refined. Like I mentioned, a lot of people will use test plots to sort of get a better sense of where their initial project stocks stand. So next, users will enter in some variables related to project costs and credit prices. The credit price is editable. You can enter in any number there. Something conservative, like here in the example, we have $9, or if you think you have a really more enthusiastic buyer that will pay a higher price, you can play around with that a little bit. We also have fields for verification costs, inventory and other development costs, and project maintenance costs. And these are all variables that users can toggle between some suggestions that we have. But users can also manually override those values and enter in a more specific price point if they feel like those costs are not reflective of their actual property. And then once that's all entered, the tool outputs a ballpark net present value for the life of the project. So again, like I mentioned, this is really high level, and it's meant to be sort of a first filter. Obviously, we cannot guarantee these prices or the costs, but our suggestion is that you play around with this a little bit, see what seems to work, and if the NPV is consistently coming out positive, then it might be worth it for the landowner to consider reaching out to a project developer or a consulting forester to work through a more detailed estimate and talk about whether moving forward with the project might make sense. Our standardized inventory methodology, or SIM, is a guidance document that we published during the last version of our voluntary forest protocol, which was version 4.0. Carbon inventories require a much higher level of precision than your standard timber inventory. And there are strict guidelines around sampling error and update schedules in order to conform with the requirements of the protocol and pass verification. So SIM was informed by the many projects we've reviewed over the years and our observations about where challenges have arisen during verification. The document provides guidance around stratification, monumenting plot center, plot layout, guidance around using the walkthrough method when plots fall near strata boundaries, and then detailed instructions for how each required measurement should be taken. It does come pre-verified, so anyone in our voluntary program who uses SIM does not have to have their inventory methodology re-verified. Essentially, the verifiers would just need to confirm that the project is actually implementing this methodology in the field as it's written. So it's our hope that this will actually save time in the verification process, which should reduce costs. The tool, or the methodology, is designed to work with our inventory tool. And it's also consistent with the requirements of the compliance offset protocol under California's program as well. Although the pre-verification would not apply to that program. It would still have to be re-verified. And the methodology is also designed to have enough flexibility to work with a variety of forest types so that it can be used sort of across the country without having to reinvent the wheel every time. Our inventory tool, Carat, is an access database tool that we've designed to allow projects to manage their inventories in-house. This is a service that a lot of project developers provide to their clients, but once that service contract ends, it may not be possible for the landowner to continue to use that same inventory since they're often developed with proprietary software. This tool uses a Microsoft Access database. It's compatible with SIM, and once we publish it, it's going to be available for free on our website. And like SIM, it will work with our voluntary protocol. It's also compatible with the compliance offset protocol. and it comes pre-verified for our voluntary program. The tool allows projects to enter inventory data, grow their plots forward through the tool's link to FVS, and automatically calculate carbon values using approved volume and biomass equations that are pre-programmed into the tool. So again, we're hoping to make project management accessible to a wider audience of forestry professionals and hopefully bring down some costs for landowners. So this is what the Carat interface looks like. The first main section allows users to enter raw data or import inventory data from Excel sheets. The tool has data checks built in to prevent transcription errors. And inventory data is clearly organized at the stratum, plot, and tree level. All the data is also associated with the reporting year, and plots can be revised when they're remeasured, or they can be excluded when harvested. The next section is where the database links to FVS. Any plots that haven't been measured in a given year can simply be grown forward with the click of a button, essentially. And then the tool also generates carbon stock reports, which is useful for the mandatory annual reporting for a project. So the program can output CO2 at the project, strata, plot, or tree level, depending on what you need. And it can generate reports for confidence statistics and species diversity, which are other required elements for project reporting, and should make the process of preparing for verification that much easier. Carat is not quite available for download on our website yet, but we're planning to release it soon in conjunction with our version 5.0 protocol update. And one of the biggest changes we're making to implement with version 5.0 is to introduce a standardized project baseline. Typically, IFM projects have had to go through an extensive and costly modeling process to arrive at their baseline in order to incorporate all legal and financial constraints to ensure additionality of the project. The standardized project baseline provides an option for projects to enter information into a screening tool. And if the screening is successful, then projects can use a more simplified baseline equation and skip this expensive modeling process. So I'll show you a little bit of what the screening tool looks like. Essentially, this assesses whether a project could harvest down to an assessment area of reference value. This is based on specific legal and financial constraints applicable to the project. And the assessment area of reference value that I'm talking about is similar to the common practice values that are currently used to inform project baselines. What this tool is looking for is basically that if a project is too constrained, then the standardized baseline equation would not be conservative enough, in which case we would still require them to go through the modeling process. So to start, the project inputs some basic information, including that reference value, which is a basal area reference value based on FIA data. And we're still sourcing those final values from FIA, but you can see sort of some proxy data that we have on our website if you're interested in looking at that. Next, the project selects a stumpage value. This is also a standardized value associated with the project's assessment area, and again, is available in a simple lookup table in that data file. The project then has to stratify by legal constraints. So this could include unconstrained areas, areas affected by the Endangered Species Act, the California Forest Practice Rules, whatever happens to be relevant to that project area. And for each different harvest constraint, the project will need to estimate the basal area retention required to meet the terms of that particular constraint. Finally, the project has to enter a breakdown of commercial versus non-commercial species for each of these areas. And this is how we've embedded the financial feasibility aspect of the baseline analysis. The ratio of commercial to non-commercial species is compared to that standardized stumpage value. And the assumption made in the tool is that a lower stumpage value will equate to a lower ability to reduce non-commercial species to achieve the minimum basal area retention required by the legal constraint. Areas with higher stumpage values would have a higher ability to invest in reductions of non-commercial species to achieve that baseline level. And then at the bottom of the tool, we have these 3 gray boxes. They have values that are compared to determine the final eligibility of the project to use the standardized baseline equation. So first is the assessment area basal area reference value that I mentioned earlier. That comes from the FIA data. And we do adjust that value slightly to account for growth and yield. And then second, we have the weighted average basal area retention required to meet all of those legal constraints that were listed above. And then that weighted average is then adjusted based on the stumpage value and the ratio of commercial to non-commercial species. So that final output that includes both the legal constraints and the financial constraints is compared to the assessment area reference value. And then based on that comparison, the tool will tell you whether you can proceed with the standardized baseline equation or whether you must proceed with the typical modeled approach. And I'll show that on the next couple of slides. So this example shows a project with high stumpage values where the weighted average minimum retention after the constraints is below the reference value. So what this means is that they could feasibly reduce their stocks below the assessment area standard. And therefore, we believe that they could achieve a baseline at or near common practice. So we approve them to proceed with the standardized baseline approach because we are confident that the standardized baseline will be conservative in this case. On the flip side, for this example, we have a project where they're a little bit more constrained in terms of the legal requirements, and they also have lower stumpage values and more non-commercial species. So in this case, the weighted average after adjusting for those constraints is above the reference value. You have the weighted average is close to 97, and the reference value is close to 79. So in this case, we believe that there is a risk that the standardized baseline would not be conservative enough for this project. So they would have to go forward with the typical baseline modeling approach if they decide they want to move forward with the project. They would have to make the case to us that their baseline is conservative. And then lastly, I just wanted to quickly highlight sort of our more classic tools, which are the calculation workbooks that we've made available for performing the offsets calculations. We have these both for harvested wood products calculations and overall project carbon stock calculations. They're designed to help ensure that projects are correctly computing the equations required by the protocol and are really handy tools to be able to submit to the verifiers at the end of the year to check and go through the verification process. And we do have versions of these tools available for each and every version of the voluntary protocol and the compliance protocol. And with that, I think we can head into our Q&A.
Okay, thank you so much, Sarah. This was really interesting. We have we got a good number of questions rolling in while you were speaking, so I have plenty of things to discuss here, but that was really interesting overview, and I know I really appreciate the kind of technical oversight, and sharing screenshots of the tools themselves is really useful to provide that context. Just to start off from a kind of high-level question is, what were in terms of the new forest protocol version 5.0, what are the next steps in the timeline once the public comment period ends?
Sure, yeah, so after the public comment period ends, we'll be assessing all of the comments that we received, and we basically go through them one by one and look for anything that people have pointed out that we still need to address in the protocol. So we'll continue to make edits in response to those comments and put together a new protocol, detailed responses to comments, and then that package goes to our board of directors for adoption. And that timeline would be mid-October is when we would be taking that to our board for review and hopefully to have it adopted and posted.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. This next question, as I think you ended up addressing this to a degree, is about feasibility for smaller landowners. I know you spoke at length about your interest in having these tools to help bring that threshold down further. But I kind of wanted to loop around on this again. Where do you think, I know you mentioned kind of some, higher numbers. I think you might have said 5,000 to 7,000 acres. Do you have a sense of if with these types of tools and reducing costs for the startup costs, if you've seen that really starting to get lower and where you think that threshold could be heading?
Yeah, so for the time being, a lot of the changes that we've been making to try to address cost are really focused on our voluntary program, as that's where we sort of have the most agency to make change. However, this high sort of barrier to entry is really something that we're seeing more on the compliance side. So I guess to that point, we are always in active communication with the Air Resources Board. We've presented these suggested changes to them on a couple of occasions, and we'll continue to communicate these ideas to them in the hopes that when they do update their own forest protocol, that they'll consider some of these changes. So that's really sort of the focus in terms of bringing down the barrier to entry for smaller landowners is making changes to our voluntary protocol to reduce project development costs, reduce verification costs, and then really sort of educating the Air Resources Board about those changes in the hopes that they'll adopt them as well.
Great. And so in those cases, are you seeing kind of like a proof of concept that these smaller landowners are able to also or are able to participate more with those changes?
Yeah, we're continuing to see smaller landowners able to participate in our voluntary program, although I think the vast majority of the changes that we've made are sort of in this forthcoming version, version 5.0. So I think sort of the proof will really be when we see projects start coming in after October.
Okay. And then here I have just kind of two more questions that I've lumped under kind of a feasibility topic here. Is another question was, and this is more of a kind of a market-based question, is how do you see voluntary carbon offsets fitting into potential upcoming compliance offset schemes as maybe hopefully more states are considering cap and trade and maybe even someday if we have a federal program or some sort of oversight or requirement for that. Do you have a sense of how these markets might come together at some point?
Mm-hmm. Well, one example that we had of that was through California's program. Before the California cap and trade program really went into effect, that regulation identified a few programs and several protocols that were approved early action offset projects. So that was where we sort of saw the crossover from the voluntary to the compliance market, in that ARB approved several what were voluntary protocols and voluntary projects as eligible to transition their credits over from the voluntary program into the compliance program. And it was sort of a win-win because it really helped strengthen the voluntary program, and it also supplied the compliance market with credits as soon as that program kicked off. So I think we could potentially see a similar model for other cap and trade programs that come along in the future.
Great, thank you. And here's one that this has come up for me a few times as well for feasibility. If you have any estimates from the Climate Action Reserve available for just like what could a landowner consider as estimated tons per acre or hectare by forest type for different projects, like if you have anything available for that, like if it's a Pacific Northwest project, a reforestation project, is there any kind of loose numbers that are available, what a landowner could think the tons of carbon per acre could be at 5 or 10 years?
Yeah, I know it's kind of all over the place, and unfortunately I don't think I have a good number off the top of my head, but maybe that's something we can follow up in the written responses to questions to post later.
Yeah, that would be great. I mean, even if we just looked at pulled numbers from a project or two, just to get a sense of what do these really look like in a project, and what's creditable.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. And then to touch briefly, we did get a question about international interest in which we know is important for voluntary markets. Does Climate Action Reserve handle international activities in the voluntary space at all right now?
Yes, a little bit. Right now, our international action is primarily focused on Mexico. We have a really robust Mexico forest project protocol, and we have dozens of projects that are being listed under that protocol. And similar to our US program, we also have an inventory tool that we implement there, an inventory methodology. That tool is called CalcBoss. So we're mirroring a lot of what we're doing in the US with what we're doing in Mexico, and working with the ejidos down there to develop different forest projects. We were doing a little bit of work in terms of adapting protocols for use in Ontario, but since their cap and trade program didn't move forward, we don't have a lot of active forestry work in Canada at the moment, but something that we're keeping our eye on.
Okay, thank you. And we just got another question related to international. Does California accept gold standard certificates from projects outside of the US or Canada, for example, Central America?
No, so California does not accept projects outside of the US at the moment. They were considering a linkage, I believe, to Opera Brazil. And I'm not sure where that stands in terms of the regulatory process, but I think it is something that they're still actively considering. But currently, no, they don't accept the gold standard.
Okay, great. And I have two questions here that are related. One is, well, I think your response may link them. The first is what can compliance programs do to encourage smaller landowners and reduce costs while maintaining the high level of stringency that's required for project eligibility? So you mentioned that part of your work is communicating some of this to ARB, but what are those recommendations? And then a related question is, to what extent are you seeing aggregation of IFM projects in response to barriers for entry?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in terms of trying to encourage these changes on the compliance program, I think one thing that would be really useful is if we could get ARB to accept our pre-verification of the inventory methodology and the Carat tool. I don't know how feasible that is from their perspective, but that would definitely reduce the verification burden quite a bit. And then another, not so much a change, this is something we've always kind of done, but that we're emphasizing a little bit more, is providing more explicit verification guidance in the protocol. Part of the reason why you see increased verification times and that leads to increased verification costs is really around sort of ambiguity in the protocol and a lot of areas where the verifiers have to go back and forth with the registries and ARB a lot to work through issues that are unclear to them. So encouraging ARB to provide more black and white verification guidance in the protocol, I think would also really help. This is something that we've spoken with them about. And then in terms of aggregation, on our voluntary program, we are seeing kind of a renewed interest in aggregation. We have a couple examples of aggregated improved forest management projects, but it hasn't been, I would say, super popular. Typically, we have still seen more individual projects, but like I said, I have been getting a lot more questions about our aggregation methodology, and I think there is definitely a renewed interest there. And then on the compliance side, aggregation is not something that ARB has really allowed, other than they have sort of an unofficial aggregation option, which is that multiple landowners could go in on a single project together. So they can essentially aggregate their ownership into one project rather than an aggregate of multiple projects. Hopefully that distinction makes sense, but there are some complications there, I would say, just in terms of like the legal agreements that need to happen between those landowners. Aggregation allows there to still be a little bit more of a separation of church and state between landowners, whereas having multiple landowners go in on a project developed together can be legally a little bit more complicated. So I've seen both of those options go forward, but definitely not as frequently as individual projects.
Great, thank you so much. Another question here is, are our public forest lands or state-owned lands eligible to participate in the California protocol or California market? And if not, what are opportunities for public forest land to possibly enroll or participate? Or what's the status if they are?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so public lands are eligible for both California's compliance program and our voluntary program. Not federal, but any public non-federal land, state, county, city, those are all possible. I would say that a barrier to that on the compliance side is that there's not great guidance around how a public landowner should establish their baseline on the compliance side. It was an area of the protocol that was sort of overlooked when it was initially developed. I say that because we are the ones who developed the protocol originally. And so it is something that we addressed in version 4.0 of our voluntary protocol. We put together a more detailed methodology for voluntary public IFM projects to develop their baseline. So I think if a public entity wanted to move forward with an IFM project on the compliance market, ARB would definitely be willing to work with them. I know they were working on developing a guidance document to help public landowners undertake an IFM project, but they haven't published it yet. So I think if you're interested, I would definitely recommend reaching out to ARB, and I'm sure they would be able to share some of that information.
Great, thank you so much. And I wanted to ask a couple quick questions here about the tools that you presented. So we have one, are the tools that you presented available free to the public? This person particularly was interested in the Carat and SBT tool, but I think the others as well we might want to know about.
Yeah, so currently they are all available for free to any members of the public, with the exception of Carat. We are working to get that one posted online as soon as possible though, and it will also be free to download to any member of the public. If you want to email me at this email address that I have posted here, I might be able to get you a beta version of the Carat tool. We have been distributing that, but we hope to have the official version posted very soon.
Great. And one question here is, do any of the methodologies allow for default values like IPCC tier data to also reduce time and costs?
We do not, no. Everything is based on a project-specific inventory. So that might be something to consider sort of maybe not on the offset side, but we have another program that we're moving forward with called Climate Forward, where we have some forest methodologies that are under development there. And that might be a program where we would consider something like that, but it's not something that we have in place at the moment.
Okay, great, thank you. And I had a couple questions here also about Corsia. So I know that this might be getting a little bit outside of your day-to-day workspace, but I think I'll present them to you to see if you can respond to these. Do you have any sense of if Corsia will accept CDM offsets? And do you also know if any existing deals like ERPAs, the emission reduction agreements, that are already in place with airlines will be affected by Corsia?
Yeah, that I am afraid I cannot answer. I'm on the first question, I'm not sure if that's a known at all since they're still in the process of taking applications. On the latter question, I can probably ask my colleague who's been tracking Corsia a little bit more closely and provide a response in the written question and answers.
Great. Okay, thank you. And then I'm going to ask you one more question here, which is a kind of broader theoretical question about offsets. And it's asking to promote the concept of forest carbon credits. This person is interested in promoting this in the European space, but they want to know why not focus first on protected or high biodiversity areas? and market the financing the protection of forest biodiversity. So what are kind of the trade-offs between perhaps a more calculated carbon approach versus incorporating co-benefits more explicitly?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we're very, I guess, US centric in terms of our offset program, since that's sort of what we knew best and where we had the best data to start. Our Mexico protocol does incorporate a lot of environmental and social safeguards more explicitly in the protocol, and that's something that we are starting to turn our attentions to more, and which you may see sort of incorporated more explicitly in our US protocols as well. Currently, the forest protocol does have some like natural forest management and sustainable harvesting requirements that get a little bit at those co-benefits and encourage native and diverse species. But it is something that we are paying more attention to and that you might see changing soon in our program.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for this. So I think we have just a couple outstanding questions that we will follow up with you directly, Sarah, and those will be posted to our website when we share your presentation. And I'd like to go back while I close here to pull up our overview once again. So to wrap up here, we're right on the hour, so we will close. We don't want to step into too much into the 4 o'clock hour. I want to thank everyone so much for joining today. I think this was really informative, and a big thank you to you, Sarah, for your time in preparing your presentation and giving it to us today. So thank you, Sarah. And I'd also like to thank the members of the Forest Climate Working Group and the Steering Committee for their support and guidance, and all of the speakers from the 2018-2019 season that you can see here. And again, a quick reminder for anyone that joined late, you can see recordings of any of these presentations from the last year on our website you can just Google, you can see our website here, but you can also just Google Forest Carbon and Climate Program at MSU and we should pop right up. We are soliciting nominations for speakers for the next year, so please reach out to us by email if you think you would be a great speaker or your organization. We'd love to hear from you. And if you'd like to sign up for our email list and be one of the first to hear about the new upcoming series in the 2019-2020 year, please be sure that you're on our email list. If you haven't never received an email from us and you'd like to, just send us an email at forestsc@msu.edu. And we'll be sure to get you on our email list. So again, I'd like to thank our speakers throughout the entire year for their time, their information. I hope you all have a great afternoon and enjoy the rest of the summer for those in the Northern Hemisphere. Thank you so much, and we'll talk to you later in the fall. Take care, everyone.